Peter Tatchell, welcome.
Thank you very much for that exceedingly warm welcome. I'm very honoured to be here and want to thank Karen and other staff members who've organised this event. The title of today's talk is Human Rights versus Human Wrongs, the limits of human rights law. And it's to this issue about the limitations of human rights law that I want to specifically address myself today. I think we all know that after the Second World War, in reaction to the horrors of Nazism, progressively over time, a succession of major human rights statutes were passed. The most notable one, of course, that you're probably all familiar with, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. But followed soon after by the Genocide Convention, the Geneva Conventions against war crimes, and subsequently many other human rights conventions, such as the Convention Against Torture of 1984. So we have a body of human rights law which exists, and that law is very strong, very persuasive, and has the support of countries around the world. Yet everywhere on this planet we see people's human rights being violated. We see time and time again examples of human rights violations and abuses passing largely unchecked and without redress for the victims. So that is a major, major, major problem. Of course, there are also other issues. Despite the goodness of these laws, in many respects, they're not entirely complete. For example, often they don't cover the rights of disabled people, of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or intersex people. They don't cover issues like discrimination based upon genetic inheritance. They often don't cover age discrimination. So if we look at the European Convention on Human Rights, which is often upheld as the acme of human rights legislation, we see that in Article 14, which prohibits discrimination, it lists a whole series of grounds of prohibition, such as gender, race, religion, and so on, but doesn't mention disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, or genetic inheritance. So I suppose we could say that this Human Rights Convention, the European Human Rights Convention, and others are also products of their time. So when the European Convention was devised or agreed in 1950, there was no great public consciousness or political consciousness about the rights of disabled people or people who are LGBTI. And so those were not included in the legislation. They're not actually written down explicitly. As I mentioned, the other big issue is the question of non-enforcement. So even where issues are stated clearly and categorically, we see those violations happening, and so often the perpetrators are not brought to justice. Just looking at the contemporary scene, you're all familiar with what's been happening in Syria for the last 3 years or so. Shocking, outrageous, unforgivable human rights abuses by the Assad regime and by some of the rebels. These include blatant, indiscriminate massacres of civilians. Indeed, the targeting of civilian areas. Yet who has been put on trial? President Assad is still in power. His generals still pursue this indiscriminate, reckless war. None of them have been brought to justice. Right now we are witnessing the horrific attack upon the northern Syrian town of Kobani, where the Kurdish civilian population, supported by their self-defense unit, the YPG, are waging a truly heroic resistance against the Islamic State. They are fighting for their lives. You know, they don't want to fight. This is a war for them of self-defense. If they don't fight, they will be massacred. And we've seen the way in which Western countries have been wringing their hands over what to do. You know, some people are calling for Western intervention, either in terms of troops or airstrikes. Now, my view is that that would probably be counterproductive and certainly smack of neo-imperialism. I don't think the West should get involved. If we did, if we sent Western troops, that would be playing into the hands of Islamic State, because they would then be able to portray the conflict as Muslims versus the West, the people versus imperialism. So we should not walk into that trap. But on the other hand, human rights law and the obligations of solidarity with other people who are suffering terrible, terrible abuses does require the world to do something. Not just the West, the whole international community. And do it under the auspices of the United Nations, if possible. You know, if the United Nations can authorize action citing humanitarian law, which includes responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect is a recognition by the United Nations that the global community has a duty to protect people whose human rights are being violated. So it's a clear mandate for United Nations action. Now, I've argued for a long time that the United Nations, in the case of Syria and the Assad regime, should have authorized a no-fly zone to stop the Syrian Air Force barrel bombing civilian cities like Aleppo and Homs. I've also argued that the United Nations should ensure a total arms embargo to all sides in the conflict. As you know, Russia, Iran and other states are supplying weapons to help sustain the Assad regime. Neither they nor the West should be supplying arms, because those arms are fueling the conflict. So a UN no-fly zone to stop Assad's bombing of civilian areas and an arms embargo would significantly help to de-escalate the conflict. I've also argued that the United Nations should send in peacekeepers to create civilian safe havens, to protect civilian populations. That they should do this even against the wishes of the Assad regime. And that, of course, would put UN troops in danger, but for the sake of defending humanitarian principles, that's something I think the United Nations ought to be willing to do. We also need to recognize that if there were civilian safe havens, it wouldn't be a guarantee that those civilians would be safe, but it would increase the likelihood. So none of this is about perfect solutions, but I think the no-fly zone, the arms embargo, the UN peacekeepers, and civilian safe havens, together those four plans under UN auspices would reduce the conflict, would de-escalate, and would perhaps help prevent at least some of the worst excesses that are still happening today. Now the problem is, of course, the UN Security Council needs to okay this. And we've seen Russia and sometimes China either oppose or abstain on these issues. So when you've got the Security Council of the United Nations being required to unanimously agree a course of action, and when you have certain member states who do not respect human rights being prepared to use a veto, Security Council action is very difficult. One way around it could be a vote of the entire UN General Assembly of all 193 member states. That could give moral authority for these actions. Now, of course, people say, well, the UN doesn't have an army. it does have peacekeeping forces, but they are provided by member nations. Who's going to enforce the no-fly zone? Well, again, I think it would be less desirable for Western nations to do it, but I certainly see no reason why troops and air forces from more neutral nations or non-aligned nations, such as India and Nigeria, which have strong military capabilities, there's no reason why they couldn't provide the troops for the peacekeeping forces and the air force to enforce the no-fly zone. So that's just a series of proposals that I put out there for the last few years. The other proposal I put up was the idea that the International Criminal Court should issue international arrest warrants for President Assad, his key government and military chiefs, and for some of the rebels who've been involved in human rights abuses. And I am astonished to this day that the International Criminal Court has not done this. Quite clearly, contrary to the Rome Statute, which authorises the International Criminal Court to act, quite clearly it has the power to do so, yet it isn't. Now again you might say, well, how is it going to be enforced? Wouldn't this just be a gesture? Well, my response is, gestures are important. Gestures send a signal. And if an international arrest warrant was issued, that would send a very powerful signal to President Assad and his key government and military officials, plus ordinary Syrian army soldiers, that the International Criminal Court was watching and after them. And that might, and it's a big might, it might constrain them to pull back from some of the worst excesses. If they thought at some point in the future, perhaps not now, but maybe in years to come, they could be hauled before the International Criminal Court and put on trial and duly punished, maybe some of them might think twice about indiscriminate attacks upon civilian areas. And to go back to Kobani and the crisis that the Kurds face there. As you know, Kobani is one city in a region called Rojava, which is a region of northern Syria which the Kurdish people now control. And within this region they've set up a semi-autonomous democratic state which owes no allegiance to Syria or to Turkey or Iraq or anywhere else. It's a Kurdish free nation in the making. It is democratic, it's secular, and it's broadly left. It brings together all the different diverse communities in the region. There are many different ethnicities which have often been at loggerheads in that region. But the Kurdish autonomous government in Rojava has brought them all together and united them in a way that no one else has ever succeeded. So there's no sectarian infighting in Rojava. This is a model of democracy. And so I think all Democrats everywhere have a duty to support them. They are fighting for democracy, for secularism, for social justice, for freedom for the Kurdish people and other peoples who live in that region. And I think it stands in such marked contrast to what is happening in most of Iraq, Syria, and many of the other neighbouring nations. To me, the principle of international solidarity with people who are fighting for their lives is very, very important. And if we go back in history, we look back to the 1930s. In the 1930s, the democratically elected Republican government in Spain was under attack by Franco's fascist forces with the support of Hitler and Mussolini. The whole world rallied to support the democratic government against the fascist onslaught. And indeed, an international brigade was raised of volunteers from all over the world who went to Spain to fight alongside the Spanish Republican democratic government to try and save it. Unfortunately, they were defeated. But the principle is the same today. Indeed, the principle was the same during the Second World War. during the Second World War, when Britain was under onslaught from Hitler's armies, when we stood alone in Europe against that Third Reich, we valued and greatly appreciated the support of the United States. The US gave us medical supplies, military supplies, food, and of course hundreds of thousands of soldiers to help fight Nazism. So if it was good enough for democratic Republican Spain in the 1930s, if it was good enough for Britain in the 1940s fighting Nazism, then I think it's good enough for the Kurdish people fighting for their freedom today. International solidarity and practical support is absolutely vital. And even if the United Nations does not authorize it, the Kurdish people are saying, any country, wherever you are, please help us. They want heavy weapons to match the heavy weapons that ISIS, the Islamic State, has. They want the sharing of military intelligence to identify ISIS positions. They want communications equipment, medical supplies and food. And Turkey, as you know, has been blocking that. If you look at the border between Turkey and Syria, it's open in 90% of the areas, which is allowing Islamic State fighters to cross from Turkey into Syria. So all these jihadis from Britain and Canada and other countries, they go to Turkey, and the Turkish government allows them to pass freely across the border into Syria to join Islamic State. But around Kobani and Rojava, the border is totally closed. Turkey will not allow the fighters to cross from Turkey into Syria to aid their brothers and sisters. It's blocking personnel, it's blocking military supplies, it's blocking medical aid. Now, Turkey is a member of NATO, and NATO is committed to democracy and self-determination. NATO says that it will defend those rights and principles. Yet here we have in Rojava the Kurdish people standing for those principles, and a NATO member is blocking aid to them. In fact, even worse than that, Turkey is colluding with ISIS. Not only by leaving the border open so that jihadi recruits can get into Syria, but also, at least it's alleged, Turkey has supplied them with weapons. You're familiar with the Turkish hostages that were held by Islamic State. And after protracted negotiations, they were eventually all released. The terms of that deal were never publicly divulged. But their release coincided almost simultaneously with a train going from Turkey into northern Syria, or through parts of northern Syria rather, loaded with weapons. And the Kurdish people certainly believe that those weapons were going to ISIS in exchange for those hostages. Now, we can't prove that, but the video footage is out there, and it looks pretty damning. My view is Turkey should be suspended from NATO because of its collusion with ISIS, and not readmitted until it actually does substantive action to aid and support the Kurdish defenders in Kobani and other cities in Rojava. You know, if Turkey is not abiding by NATO principles, it should not have any right to remain within that organization. I'm not saying expel it, I'm saying suspend it. Now, as you know, in the last few days, Turkey has announced that it will allow aid to go to Kobani. It said that, but we haven't seen the aid actually get there. And this is the double game that Turkey's been playing in recent weeks. I'm sure you've all seen the pictures of the Turkish tanks on the border, overlooking Kobani, just sitting there while the city is being mercilessly destroyed by Islamic State. It's a double talk. What Turkey is doing is playing a very, very crafty game. Turkey would rather have Islamic State win than the Kurdish people, because within Turkey there's a huge Kurdish population who have been systematically repressed and persecuted for decades. And as a result, the Kurdish people have mounted an armed resistance against the Turkish state to establish their own autonomous Kurdistan within Turkey, Iraq and Syria. The Turks don't want that. The Turkish government, which is an Islamist government, does not want the Kurdish people to have their own state. So that's the reason why they're holding back. That's the reason why they're holding back. Right now, the leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan, is in jail in Turkey. The PKK is banned in Turkey. If we want to get a solution to this problem, Turkey should release Öcalan and unban the PKK so they can come into negotiations with the Turkish government, with NATO, with the United Nations, to secure a negotiated settlement. So it's a very, very simple thing. Unban the PKK, free Öcalan, get negotiations going, but at the same time send a signal to Turkey by suspending them from NATO that their collusion with ISIS is not acceptable. The other thing we need to do is, of course, make sure those weapons do get through. Now, Turkey has announced that it's going to allow a land corridor to Kobani to ensure military and humanitarian relief. As I said, we haven't actually seen that corridor yet open. We haven't seen any aid arrive. But in the interim, why not have an airdrop? Now, the United States did drop the other day 24 tons of military and medical supplies into Kobani. It could easily do that every day, because 24 tons is nowhere near enough. It doesn't matter whether it's the United States, the United Nations, Britain, India, Nigeria. It doesn't matter which country does it. But some country needs to do that. An airdrop into Kobani to provide the military and medical aid, the food supplies and so on that they need. That strikes me as an obvious way to go. So I've done quite a digression in my talk to discuss these contemporary issues. To go back to the other principles involved, I mentioned a number of things. First of all, that we have this great body of human rights law, which is really exceptional, extraordinary and praiseworthy. The flaws are that it doesn't necessarily cover all forms of discrimination and human rights abuses, and it's not often enforced, that major abusers often get away with it. The other failing is, of course, that much of the discussion around human rights is focused on issues of liberty and equality. The right of Muslim or Jewish or gay people to be not discriminated against, or the right to free speech and freedom of religion or belief. These are what are generally understood as human rights. But of course, human rights are also about economic, social and cultural rights. And in fact, there's a United Nations Convention called the Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which looks at other issues such as the right to basic education and health care, the right to food and nutrition, the right to clean water. Here I have in my hand a bottle of water. It tastes good. It's not going to harm me. It's pure. Yet this morning, 800 million people woke up with no safe, clean drinking water. 800 million. You know, in so many countries, to get water, people have to trek miles. And even then the water is dirty and often infected. Tonight, and every single night, 10,000 parents will bury a child that has died from drinking dirty water. Dirty water bearing dysentery, cholera, typhus, and so on. Now that too is a human right, abuse. It's an abuse of human rights for people not to have safe, clean drinking water. I think it's really important also that people have the right to celebrate and speak their own language and culture. So, for example, in Iran, the Arab minority population is forbidden to culturally express their Arab identity. You know, Arab language education is prohibited in schools. Arab language newspapers are banned. Arab cultural organisations are banned. In West Papua, occupied by Indonesia, there's a complete suppression of the Melanesian culture of those black people in West Papua, the western half of New Guinea, by a Javanese-dominated Indonesian state, which is culturally and ethnically completely different, but wishes to dominate West Papua. And over the years, Indonesia has poured in hundreds of thousands of Javanese migrants to swamp the indigenous black population, to swamp them not only in terms of demographics, in terms of population numbers, but also culturally and psychologically. So what I'm trying to say is, economic, social and cultural rights are also human rights, but they are largely not acknowledged and largely ignored and not enforced. The other problem is that, of course, when it comes to human rights, it's usually only the small guys that actually get hauled before the courts. So I'm sure you're all familiar that Charles Taylor of Liberia was arraigned before the courts over human rights abuses in his country and was duly sentenced. The same with the former president of Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic. He was taken to The Hague and put on trial. And both these men deserved to be prosecuted, tried and punished. But the paradox is that, of course, the really big human rights abusers never have been taken to court. So you could argue that what Tony Blair and George W. Bush did in Iraq in 2003 was a violation of human rights. Even if you agree that it was necessary to go to war, the indiscriminate nature of the attacks which killed so many civilians in Iraq, that clearly was a war crime. And it was authorised by Tony Blair as the Prime Minister of this country and George W. Bush as the President of the United States. They had direct personal responsibility for authorising that battle plan, which led to so many Iraqi civilian deaths. Now, they were also complicit in so-called extraordinary rendition, whereby people suspected of terrorism, not proven to be terrorists, but suspected of terrorism, were snatched off the street to out of their homes, bundled onto planes, and taken to third countries where they were subjected to torture. So in other words, the British and American governments didn't want to dirty their hands by torturing anyone themselves, so they could claim complete innocence, but they were happy for their intelligence agencies to kidnap other people and take them to other countries where they were then tortured with the connivance of the security agencies of our country and indeed the United States. Likewise, a succession of Israeli leaders have never been held to account in law for the attacks and abuses on the rights of the Palestinian people. You know, the successive wars that have been waged in the Middle East, involving Israel both in Lebanon and in Gaza, have involved massive human rights abuses based on indiscriminate attacks upon civilian areas. Now, of course, the Israelis argue, with some justification, that they were subjected to indiscriminate attacks upon their civilians by Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other fundamentalist groups. And they're quite right that Hamas and Islamic Jihad were also guilty of grave human rights abuses by firing rockets into civilian areas. Under international law, attacks upon civilian areas, no matter what has happened before, is absolutely forbidden. There is never any justification for indiscriminate attacks upon civilian populations. Yet both sides in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have done exactly that. They're both wrong. They're both wrong. Neither the Hamas leader nor Ariel Sharon or Benjamin Netanyahu have ever been put on trial for the attacks that they authorized. They're too big, too powerful, they've got too many strong allies. And sadly, this is where human rights law falls down. It's often a victim of geopolitics, of a particular country and who's backing them. The United Nations and the International Criminal Court seems afraid to take on the big guys. If we look at Russia, for example, President Putin, the outrageous terror campaign that he unleashed in Chechnya, which involved gross human rights abuses, amply documented by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and others, he should have been arrested and put on trial. But again, the International Criminal Court, the UN Special Tribunals never convened, never authorized any action against President Putin. And why was that? It's simply realpolitik. Putin is too big, too powerful. He's got too many allies. So he gets away with it, whereas poor old Charles Taylor and Slobodan Milosevic, rightly, of course, end up in the dock. Even here in Britain, there's a very strong argument to say that the 1970s Labour Prime Minister Jim Callaghan and the 1980s Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher should have been put on trial for human rights abuses in the north of Ireland. We know from the government's own competent committee in the 1970s that the British Army, with high state authorisation from Whitehall, from the government, engaged in acts of torture against known or merely suspected IRA or Republican activists. There was internment without trial. No trial, no judge, no jury. For several years, there was internment without trial. Again, a complete violation of international human rights law. We also know that Amnesty International and the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Britain was guilty of grave human rights abuses in the north of Ireland. We sent SAS and other undercover assassination squads to murder, without trial, certain known or suspected Republicans. The full story has never ever come out. It will eventually come out, but these death squads were authorized at the top by military chiefs and must have had the authorization of successive British governments. You may have heard about a program that was shown on ITV called Death on the Rock, where British military and intelligence officials shot dead 3 IRA people in Gibraltar. Now, it may have been that they were going there to plant a bomb. That seems to be the case. They were going there to plant a bomb, and that's absolutely wrong. But to shoot them dead in cold blood is not the democratic way, it's not the British way, and it's not consistent with human rights. So you get my drift. When it comes to human rights law, it is not evenly applied. There are double standards. Take President Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Despite all the murders and tortures and rapes that he authorized, he's never been indicted, never been subject to international arrest warrant. And when twice I tried to make a citizen's arrest, once in London and once in Brussels, I was arrested, despite having the evidence, despite having clear evidence, affidavits from victims, he was allowed to go. In Brussels, I was actually beaten unconscious in front of Belgian police and Secret Service agents. They stood there and watched while President Mugabe's bodyguards beat me unconscious when I tried to serve an order for his arrest on him. I also went to court. I tried through the French courts when Mugabe made a visit to France. I tried through the Belgian government when he went to Belgium. I tried here in Britain when he came to visit Britain. I went to Bow Street Magistrates Court. I applied for an arrest warrant, providing the evidence of 2 black journalists in Zimbabwe who'd been tortured on Mugabe's orders. Their torture was not only contrary to the United Nations Convention Against Torture, it was also illegal under Britain's own anti-torture law, Section 134 of the Criminal Justice Act 1988. I was denied all those requests for arrest warrants. The arguments, the reasoning was, I think, of dubious legality. But that's how power works. I remember the judge actually saying to me, "Are you proposing that I should issue on your instructions with this evidence an arrest warrant for the president of Zimbabwe? He is the president." Well, the judge seemed to me in awe of the fact that he was a president. I just saw him as a human rights abuser. I did a similar thing with Henry Kissinger, the former US Secretary of State. It was in 2004. I also applied at Bow Street Magistrates Court for an arrest warrant for Henry Kissinger on the grounds in the late 60s, early 70s, he had authorized the mass indiscriminate bombing of Cambodia, which had resulted in the deaths, injuries or displacement of over 2 million people. Quite clearly contrary to the Genocide Convention and in particular the Geneva Conventions against War Crimes. I remember the judge saying to me, "Mr. Tatchell, you have presented a very compelling case. The evidence you present deserves very serious consideration. These are grave matters. But, Mr. Tatchell, are you actually proposing that I issue an arrest warrant for Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State of the United States during the presidency of Richard Nixon? Are you really expecting me to issue such a warrant?" My answer was yes. A human rights abuser, high or low, should be put on trial and suffer the consequences. So then we got into an argument about, well, let's suppose, the judge said, that I issue an arrest warrant. Are you really suggesting that the former US Secretary of State should be arrested and put in Pentonville prison? Again, I said to him, a criminal is a criminal. The background, the status is irrelevant. Judge this issue on the facts. But then I saw him look rather grieved at my face, and so I said to him, but there is an alternative, Your Honour. I said, I understand that Henry Kissinger is very fond of Oxfordshire. He loves Oxfordshire. And I have in my briefcase here a list of estate agents in the Oxfordshire area with properties to rent. And what I propose is that you would authorise Henry Kissinger to be placed under house arrest in a property of his choosing. The judge chuckled and then moved on. In the end, no arrest warrant was issued. The judge argued that he doubted my ability to bring the necessary witnesses to court. I had witnesses, people who'd worked in the National Security Agency with Henry Kissinger, who could attest to his intimate, direct personal involvement in the mass indiscriminate bombing of Cambodia. But the judge says, I don't believe you have the wherewithal and capacity to bring them to Britain and to appear in court. So the case was dismissed. So another example of a human rights abuser escaping justice. Another example, I'm sure you're familiar with Pakistan, a member of the Commonwealth, gained its independence from Britain in 1947. Simultaneously, a place called Baluchistan also gained its independence from Britain in 1947. Baluchistan now comprises of half the landmass of Pakistan and has nearly all the oil and mineral wealth. Baluchistan's independence lasted a year. Pakistan wanted Baluchistan, so they invaded in 1948, annexed Baluchistan, and have held it under military occupation ever since. The people of Baluchistan never had a vote about whether they wanted to be part of Pakistan. They didn't. Their own parliament voted against incorporation into Pakistan. They had a democratic parliament which voted against incorporation. Yet here we are, more than 60 years later, and the people of Baluchistan are still under occupation. And what is happening there is just unconscionable. The Pakistan military, which occupies the whole region, has forts all over the country. Anybody who speaks out against Pakistani rule or defends Baluchistan or its culture, they'll be kidnapped in the middle of the night or off the street in broad daylight. Then a few weeks later, their bullet-ready body or their tortured body will be found dumped by a roadside. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have documented hundreds of these cases. Hundreds. And it's happening right now. Every week there are reports coming out of another body being found. Students, lawyers, journalists, farm workers, factory workers, you name it. They just get snatched, tortured, shot, and dumped. The United Nations has failed totally to address this issue. It has never properly called Pakistan to account. There's no prosecutions even been attempted. And again, it's because of geopolitics. It's about Pakistan and its allies ganging up to block any votes, to block any investigations. The Sudanese leader, Omar al-Bashir, who presided over the mass slaughter in Darfur, has never been put on trial. There has been an arrest warrant issued for him, which is an interesting thing, that's good, but he's never been taken to court. You know, he could be snatched. You know, some kind of snatch squad could go in and grab him, like they could do with President Assad. It's not inconceivable, it's possible. Some of these people could be snatched by sending in an SAS or Navy SEALs type snatch squad. Of course, it would have to be under United Nations or International Criminal Court authorization. Shouldn't be done unilaterally by any Western government, but the capacity is there. The question is, why isn't it being done? One of the other big issues is that historically, heads of state have been immune from prosecution. It's been like a little sort of club. Basically, all the leaders of the world have agreed that they shouldn't be subject to human rights law, that they should be above it. So in lots of these different legislations, there is written exemptions for heads of state, or heads of state are not specifically covered. And as a convention in custom and practice of international law, heads of state and other high government officials have not been subjected to human rights law. To which my argument is, what's the point of having human rights law if the main perpetrators are exempt? You know, why is it that the people who are orchestrating so many of these abuses are exempt? Now, thankfully, the Rome Statute, which set up the International Criminal Court in 1998, in Article 27, finally addressed this issue by stating that heads of state and other high government officials do not have immunity under the Rome Statute. That's the first time. But still, we've yet to see it used much, if at all. So there's another issue. We have to ensure that heads of state are held accountable for what they do. Just a couple of points on the future. I think we need a new international human rights convention under the auspices of the United Nations, which would be enforceable in both the national courts of the member states and through the International Criminal Court. So individuals would have redress. So for example, in Russia, the courts are stymied by the Putin regime. There are very few independent judges left. Basically, Putin sends an order and a judge does what he's told. You know, that has to change. The way to change it, it can't be changed in the immediate term in Russia itself. So therefore Russian citizens have to have recourse to a court outside the country that can rule on their claims of human rights abuse. So this would be a way of getting around the fact that national governments often block or stymie attempts to use their own courts to enforce the human rights conventions they've signed up to. Because all these countries have signed these conventions, you know, but they use the national courts and the nobbling of judges. And it happens in Uganda, for example, a Commonwealth country. You know, the judges are often nobbled to ensure that no successful claims are brought against the government. So this external court, this international court, would be one way around that. Another idea is a permanent UN enforcement agency with peacekeeping and military powers. So I think we need some kind of, almost like a UN standing army, which is not concerned with wars of aggression or offence or expansionism, but purely self-defensive with the aim of enforcing the peace. And that obviously should be a multinational force, predominantly from non-Western countries, to ensure a proper balance that reflects the United Nations. But again, in situations like what happened in Darfur at the hands of the Sudanese regime, what's happening now in Syria, we need some international peacekeeping force that can step in and halt the killing. The final point, of course, is that we need a public consciousness around the world that these human rights laws exist and they have a right and responsibility to hold their governments to account. So we need a people-to-people movement across borders which builds a global campaign, a bit like the campaign against apartheid, where people in all different countries united in solidarity with the South African people fighting against apartheid. We need that kind of campaign to ensure that human rights law is adhered and upheld. So a citizens' global movement for human rights, that's another thing we need. These aren't perfect blueprints. These are not absolute solutions. But they're ideas and points I think we should discuss and debate. And so now what I want to suggest is that we discuss some of these ideas and anything that you may have by way of an alternative. And I haven't got all the answers. I'm very open and willing to listen to your suggestions as well. So thank you very much. So it's open to questions, answers, contributions, criticisms. It's your call.
Thank you very much. I wonder, on your last point about consciousness, have you seen the film The Act of Killing?
No.
It's a really interesting film where a man who was responsible for murdering people revisits the acts of murder that he perpetrated and learns that that wasn't such a good thing to do after all. And recently in the Education Studies programme here, there was the film The Eye of the Storm was shown to some students, which was Blue and Brown Eyes. Mm. And I wonder if you think there's a mechanism for understanding what human rights are that could be taught to people as a simple lesson in schools.
Well, although I haven't seen those films, there are many other similar films which tell personal stories of both the victims and the perpetrators. So it tells what happens from both sides, and then both sides reflect on what they've done and what they've seen. There's a fantastic film recently about human rights abuses in Indonesia, where former political prisoners who had been terribly tortured confronted their torturers, and each told their story, and then had this great cathartic sort of reconciliation and forgiveness, which was quite awesome. But I think that's the kind of film that does need to be shown, not just in schools but everywhere, because that's a way of humanising the reality of human rights abuses. We can talk about, like I have in a very general sense, about principles and philosophy, but at the end of the day, hearing the personal story, the personal witness, is much more powerful.
I like your idea of having a global citizens movement, and I think something like what happened with South Africa and ending apartheid, and I think something like that has been building momentum for the Gaza conflict recently, but it seems to have lost momentum now that there's been a ceasefire. But in this country, at the same time, we're having this Tory and UKIP kind of move to push to scrap the Human Rights Act. So it's obviously fallen out of favour in the UK, and I feel that part of that, and especially from people like UKIP, it comes down to kind of a deep-seated racism, that they feel this idea of people outside of Britain governing British laws, and so where would that leave us really if we didn't have the Human Rights Act? I'm fearful of not having that recourse. But even having said that, though, with all these cuts to legal aid, although we have in theory got this recourse to European Court of Human Rights, it's a theoretical recourse for most of us. So there's in Britain right now anyway, I think it's a bad time for human rights.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The Conservatives plan to scrap or water down the Human Rights Act, and to withdraw in whole or part from the European Convention on Human Rights would be an absolute disaster. Those legislations, those frameworks exist to protect us against an overbearing, intrusive state. They were set up precisely in order to ensure that abuses didn't happen. As I said, the European Convention was a response to the Nazi atrocities of the Second World War, and Britain played a leading role in establishing the European Convention. So for us to pull out would put us in the same company as Belarus, a tyrannical communist regime, which is also withdrawn from the European Convention on Human Rights. And we would have no moral authority to talk to other countries about human rights abuses if we had withdrawn from the European Convention. Likewise with the Human Rights Act. It brings the Convention home and gives us domestic redress. To get rid of it would strengthen the power of the state over the citizen. The Human Rights Act says to the state, these are certain red lines over which you cannot pass. Even if Parliament wants to do X, Y and Z, if these are violations of human rights, that's a no-no. So it's about protecting the rights of you and me. And when I look at the many, many achievements through the Human Rights Act and through the European Convention, we would be a much poorer country in terms of quality of life and rights without them. You think of women's rights, gay rights, pension rights, maternity rights, social rights in the workplace. All these have come about, and many more, as a result of the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act. It would be an absolute disaster for us to throw that away.
Sam Tucker, Professor of Education. We're signatories, Peter, as you know, to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I'd appreciate your analysis in a similar way that you've done it in relation to other rights you've talked about the failure in this country to protect children and safeguard children, particularly looking at the position of the judiciary, the church and the political executive, and their unwillingness to actually tackle the issues around child protection and safeguarding. And I wonder what your thoughts are around that.
Yeah, I think often the law and legislators have a very patronising view towards children. I tend to look at children as being young citizens and having the same rights as everyone else. Just because you reach a certain age doesn't mean you should have more rights than someone below that age. So the rights and principles of protection and safeguarding, they apply to adults, they also apply to children. And they need to be enforced. And I think that if some of the things that have been happening to children were happening to adults, there'd probably be a much bigger outcry than there has been when it affects young kids. I also think that the framework needs to be changed. Yes, we do need protection undoubtedly, and that protection needs to be strengthened, and it needs to be enforced. Yet again, this issue of enforcement. But also, it also needs to be about empowering young people. Empowering people to know and understand their rights and to assert them. And obviously, a little baby can't assert their rights, but, you know, a younger person, you know, in their sort of early teens certainly can and should be empowered and encouraged and supported to do that. And I think education in human rights, education in children's rights or young people's rights ought to be part of the education curriculum. That's the way we get action.
Picking up from that, we were talking on the way here actually about at what age were we politicised in our lives. Because I was talking to somebody this morning who I actually taught, and at 25 she doesn't know what socialism or communism is, which quite worries me. I'm glad that I didn't teach her in that field. And I was sort of reflecting on the fact that when I was a teenager there was a real fear that any minute Russia could push that button and we would be dust. So I suppose I feel that I belong to a generation who felt that they had to act and they had to take some level of responsibility about what happened in the world. And my fear is that as we're moving into a society that's very instant and very self-centred, that people lose that ability to see that politics is every person's right, or activity to change the world is every person's right. How on earth do you cope with the frustration that there are so many people blindly walking through society and not changing it? But how do we change that?
I share absolutely your frustration and concern. It is very dispiriting that, you know, a large swathe of young people don't seem to be politically conscious nor engaged. And it's not for its own sake, it's because through political consciousness and engagement, you can assert your rights. You can change things that are wrong for the better, and that will benefit you and the people you love and care about. So to me, political engagement and involvement is not something for, you know, weird, obsessive people who have got nothing else to do with their lives. It ought to be central to all our lives, because it affects us all. And if we don't take responsibility, politicians will take it from us. You know, and that's the big problem. You know, we've given politicians too much power. And that's partly because we've given them power in terms of legislation and frameworks, but also because just we aren't engaged. And I think one of the problems with representative democracy is the tendency is, well, you elect a politician and let them get on with it. You know, to me, democracy is about much more than voting once every 5 years. It's also about a constant process of consultation and negotiation between the rulers and the ruled, where we influence and pressure and persuade and agitate to hold governments to account. Because, you know, being elected is not a carte blanche to do what you want. You know, first of all, you've got to honour your commitments that you made prior to the election, and secondly, as new issues arise, governments need to be mindful of consulting with people and not just pursuing a party or ideological agenda.
Mark?
Yeah, and so picking up on the point about a depoliticised sort of population, I mean, we are consciously trying to engage our students in being more politically aware, but increasingly also aware of the levels of social control, increasing levels of social control, preventing people from organising themselves, even when we've got new movements, new social movements of a political nature. And my question, I guess, for you is, has controversy been your friend or your enemy in your political career? Because you mentioned, and you alluded to that a second ago, that people sometimes marginalise dissenting voices through the active expression of a controversial argument. Is controversy useful, or is it a way of, you know, marginalising people, do you think?
Well, firstly, I've never set out to be controversial for its own sake, but I've been willing to be controversial to pursue a good cause. Many of the stands I've taken were very controversial at their time. You mentioned about my opposition to Australia and America's involvement in the Vietnam War in the 1960s. Well, that was in Australia when I was growing up very unpopular. Most people totally supported the war and thought this was a necessary and just war. And to campaign against that, I mean, I nearly lost my job, my first job, because I was active in the anti-war movement. You know, and there's been many other issues. You know, campaigning on LGBTI rights in the late 60s, early 70s, again, was very unpopular. You know, there's very little public support. But, you know, for better or worse, I've sought to follow my conscience. You know, I may be right, I may be wrong, but at the end of the day, I'm doing what I believe to be right. And I think that's all we can ask anyone to do. Do what you believe is right. Of course, listen to your critics, you know, hear alternative points of view, assess the evidence, and be prepared to change your mind. That's important. But do then follow your conscience. And I think that, say, the progress with LGBTI rights has been one from the margins to the mainstream. It's taken 40 years or 50 years, but you know, we have achieved phenomenal, extraordinary change. You've got to remember that until 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world. So many aspects of gay male life remained criminalised. Of course, in 1967 there was a partial decriminalisation, but it only applied to England and Wales. It didn't apply to Scotland until 1980, and not to the north of Ireland until 1982. And that was only as a result of a judgment in the European Court of Human Rights, which said the ban on same-sex relations in the north of Ireland was illegal. When you think about it, the law that sent Oscar Wilde to prison in 1895, the so-called gross indecency law, was only repealed in 2003. The law against sodomy, or anal sex, which was passed in 1533 during the reign of King Henry VIII, was only repealed 11 years ago. It's only for the last 11 years we've had a sexual offences code that does not discriminate based on sexual orientation. Now that is an extraordinary series of changes. It's taken a long time, and as I said to begin with, it was not a popular cause. Nowadays, we know that most British people think that there's nothing wrong with being gay or lesbian, bisexual, transgender or intersex. That's just part of the natural spectrum of human sexuality and gender identity. But it's taken us a long time, but we are there. So sometimes you have to be in for the long haul. Sometimes you know, we all want instant results, and yeah, instant results are good, but you know, sometimes it takes a while.
Quite neatly following on from that, I was talking to my daughter the other day, and she was asking, well, she's a couple of years ago now, she was saying, when you were a student, Mum, what marches did you go on? So I reeled off C&D, anti-apartheid, anti-clause 28. What's clause 28? So I told her what clause 28 was, and she looked at me and she just said, Mum, that's ridiculous. And like the hairs just stood up on the back of my neck, that to her now, that just seems unconscionable. And I went to see you, Peter, when I was a student at Sheffield University. Gay Sock invited you, and you spoke about clause 28. And so I was sat where some of you guys are sat now, then, nearly 30 years ago. And it was a brilliant, brilliant evening, and I learned a lot from you. It was fantastic. The point I wanted to make was that before my dad died, you couldn't overhear the words Tony Blair on the radio, on the television, wherever he'd be in the house, and he always had radios on in the house, and he was very sort of conscious of the news. He would just shout, "War criminal!" Furious. And he died in 2004. And I just think now, if you could hear what's said about Tony Blair, his humanitarianism, his intervention in the Middle East, his process, I can hear the sound of a distant spin cycle, basically, coming from his great... And I just think we associate human rights abuses with, I don't know, theatre of war, heated conflict, but for somebody to sit and rationally take these decisions, I still don't understand. How do you sleep at night? How do they sleep at night? I mean, I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
On the first point, just in case anybody here doesn't know, Section 28 was passed by the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher in 1988. And it prohibited the so-called promotion of homosexuality by local authorities, or local authorities promoting same-sex relationships as a, quote, pretended family relationship. Really weird wording. None of it was properly defined. But as a result, lots of local authorities, in other words, local councils, local education authorities, and local health authorities basically excluded LGBT people. So you had teenage helplines for gay people suddenly having their funding cut off because the government feared if they funded them it would be promoting homosexuality. You had local lesbian groups being refused permission to meet on council premises in like local libraries or school halls because that might be promoting homosexuality. You had books by gay authors taken out of school libraries. Gay, touring companies that had plays by gay authors or with some mild, innocuous gay content suddenly were banned from schools. So it was a very repressive thing, and of course, it's being echoed today in Russia, where they have a similar law. Russia last year passed a similar law banning the promotion of, quote, non-traditional sexual relations, i.e. same-sex relations. So, we have given the world a legacy. Until Britain passed this law, no one had such a law. But now quite a few countries have, and even more are planning them. So it's a poisonous legacy we have given. On the second point, which was Tony Blair, yeah. See, the problem is, if you exclude the Iraq War, you could say that actually Tony Blair's government did quite a few good things. The national minimum wage, devolution of power to Wales and Scotland, the Human Rights Act, the legislation around disability rights, age discrimination, the rights of LGBTI people. All those things were very good. Sadly, it's all poisoned by what was done in Iraq and the way in which it was done, against the wishes of the majority of the British people. So, I don't think Tony Blair, outside of the political elite, has much credibility because of that. It's a real tragedy. And I'm sure someone one day is going to write the great film or do the great play about this. How someone who held considerable promise, despite his rather sort of reformist revamping of Labour as New Labour, leave that aside. But in terms of some of the things his government did achieve, they were quite extraordinary and remarkable. And it's a tragedy that legacy has been so damaged by the Iraq War, and that since and despite that, he's got this huge platform for the political elite globally to intervene and be involved in all these different places around the world. It doesn't make sense to me.
Going back a bit, where you're talking about getting countries involved in embargoes and helping the UN, and I'd say that most countries only get involved if they actually have interests in that country that they want to support. So you said World War II, that America joined Britain in the fight against Nazi Empire. That was, I'd say, because they were fighting Japan already as retaliation for Pearl Harbor, and Germany declared war on them, so it was merely a reciprocatory gesture. And the West has lots of interests mainly in oil in the Middle East, so they have an interest in getting involved there, whereas other countries wouldn't have so much of an interest. And there are numerous human rights abuses across the world, but the fact that most of the countries that the UN has got involved in have been oil-producing countries says something about the sort of thoughts behind the big countries.
You're absolutely right that realpolitik and vested economic interest is often a driving force or an added impetus to Western engagement and intervention. So you could say, for example, take umpteen different countries around the world, Western Sahara, occupied by Morocco. As far as we know, no oil there, no great minerals, some phosphates, but that's about it. There's no real driving force economically for Western countries or other outside countries to engage. Now that to me is the problem. You know, human rights should not be driven by self-interest or economic interest. It should be driven by human rights. And we need to move from a situation where vested economic interests, whether it be oil or other natural resources, is a factor that does motivate engagement. We need to ensure that human rights itself is the guiding principle, and that countries recognise our common humanity. You know, we're all part of the greater, bigger human family. Whichever country we live in, whatever our cultural background, whatever our race, we are all human beings. We're all entitled to human rights. We need to support each other. We are part of this bigger family. You know, to me, the idea of looking the other way just because a country is far away or just because there isn't any economic gain, that to me is unconscionable. You know, we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't think in that way. We should be thinking about standing in solidarity and support for people who are suffering, regardless of our own self-interest, because at the end of the day, we may need the interest, compassion and solidarity of others.
Peter, I wonder if you could comment on how you think we handle, how well you think we handle situations where human rights appear to come into conflict. So, for example, I'm thinking of the bed and breakfast run by a Christian family demanding the right not to have homosexuals come and stay in their B&B. That appears to be a sort of conflict of human rights, that both sides demanding that their human rights are the prime human rights. So how do we handle those sort of conflicts?
Well, for those who are not familiar, a Christian bed and breakfast couple refused to allow a gay couple to stay in their bed and breakfast because they disagreed with homosexuality. They argued it was their human right to refuse them. The gay couple said, no, you are offering a public service, you have a duty to not discriminate. By denying us accommodation in your bed and breakfast, you're not upholding your human rights, you're violating our human rights, because there's no human right to discriminate. Let's put the boot on the other foot. If it had been a gay-run bed and breakfast that had refused a Christian couple to stay because it objected to their faith, the Christian churches would have been in an absolute uproar, saying this was a violation of our human rights. And they would be quite right. They'd be quite right. So just as it's wrong for a Christian person to discriminate against a gay person, it's equally wrong for a gay person to discriminate against a Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Hindu or whatever. We have to establish the principle that human rights are for everyone. And if you start allowing exemptions, then where do you stop? Once you accept the principle that because someone holds a particular belief or religion, they can discriminate, then you're basically undermining the whole equality legal framework. You're setting up an open door through which others can walk. So, for example, you might get a situation where, let's say, a very orthodox Jewish or Muslim person working in a supermarket could turn around and say, oh, my faith doesn't allow me to involve myself with alcohol or pork. I'm not going to serve customers who come to the checkout with pork or alcohol. Well, you know, supermarkets couldn't function if everybody had the right to object to things in someone's shopping basket and refuse to serve them. You know, if you're offering a public service, you have a duty to provide that service without discrimination. And you know, that may sometimes be a tough call for some people, but at the end of the day, if we want to live in a cohesive society where everyone feels included and welcome, we have to stick by that principle. Anybody else have it?
My question is so not political at all, but I think would come in nicely because I was thinking about it, and you know, you seem to have a love and a passion for people, you know, for humans, for people, and I was wondering, you know, how did it start? Was it that you saw, you know, people around you being activists or, you know, standing up for people, or your parents, you know, who you saw, you know? I just wanted to know how you started, you know, standing up for people.
Well, first of all, let me say that when people ask me what motivates me, why do I do what I do, it's very simple. It may sound corny, but I love other people. I love freedom, justice, equality. These are my values. So when I see them being violated, I want to do something. Now, I came from a very conservative Christian evangelical family. My father was an engineer in a factory. My mother worked in a biscuit factory. Very working class, small c conservatives. No political interest, no political engagement. But, if I go back on my memory, in 1963, I remember seeing on the TV news and in the newspapers reports about the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama. A white racist had bombed a black church, killing 4 young girls about my own age. And when I heard about that, I was so profoundly shocked. How could anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in a black church on a Sunday morning saying prayers? That just shocked me so much. And so that motivated my interest in Martin Luther King and the black civil rights movement. And because I've been brought up in a Christian household, I could particularly relate to Martin Luther King because he was a Baptist minister. So that got me thinking about, my responsibility and, human rights issues. My first campaign was not until I was 15, in 1967, in Melbourne, Australia. At the time, in the state of Victoria, there was still the death penalty. And a prisoner who'd escaped from jail, Ronald Ryan, was due to be hanged for allegedly shooting dead a prison warder during an escape. Now, I read a report about the autopsy on the warder's body. And I worked out at the age of 15, from where Ronald Ryan was standing, where he fired the fatal shot, and where the warder was standing when he was hit, the trajectory of the bullet through the warder's body meant that it was almost physically impossible for Ronald Ryan to have failed that fatal shot. More likely, the warder was accidentally shot by another warder in the crossfire, because there were warders behind firing and the warder who was shot was in front of them. Anyway, he was hanged anyway. Ronald Ryan was executed despite there being reasonable doubt about his guilt. And that was really the real crunch for me. It provoked a lifelong skepticism towards authority. I thought to myself, if the government, the police and courts can allow this man to hang where there is at least some considerable doubt about whether he could have fired that fatal shot, what else are they doing that I don't know about? What other bad things are they doing? So I began to look at the way in which the Aboriginal people of Australia were being treated. And because Aboriginal people live far away on reservations or in the remote outback, not in the cities. And I was shocked to discover the poverty, the levels of illness and so on. So I began to get involved. Now, as a school student, with others, I set up a campaign to raise money to fund scholarships for Aboriginal kids so they could stay on at school and get better qualified so they could do, responsible jobs that would help their community. At that time, most Aboriginal kids were leaving at the school leaving age or even before, and of course that was just perpetuating the cycle of poverty because of a lack of skills and lack of education. So we raised, I think in 1968, we sponsored a long march along the beaches in Melbourne. I can't remember what the figure was, but it was like a huge sum of money, which set up this scholarship scheme, which exists to this day. So that's how I began.
I would like to know your opinion about PKK. Are they a terrorist organization?
Of course, the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, has been labelled as a terrorist organisation, and they have indeed engaged in acts of terrorism that I disagree with. But in the last year or so, the leadership of the PKK have begun a major rethink of their policy and strategy and are arguing in favour of a peaceful democratic struggle for Kurdish rights. They still are violently resisting attacks by the Turkish army, but they have de-escalated their campaign, and they're now committed to establishing a democratic Kurdistan, which is secular, so there's a separation between religion and the state. They are predominantly Muslims, but they don't want to impose Islam on everyone. They think it's a private individual choice. They're also embracing green issues and sustainable development. So they've become actually a very, very progressive force in the region. And that's why I support them being unbanned and Öcalan being released from jail, because they have made this move from terror attacks towards a more peaceful and negotiated settlement with the Turkish state. And I hope the Turkish government will respond and recognise these changes. The Turkish government keeps on saying, oh, they did this in 1994 or that in 2001. Well, things have moved on, and the Turkish government ought to be willing to negotiate in the same way that Britain negotiated with the IRA and secured a peace agreement in the north of Ireland with the IRA and with the UDA and the other loyalist terror groups as well. Bring them into the fold. That's the way forward.
I'm ever so sorry, Peter, but we're nearly out of time.
Okay.
I'm really, really conscious that we could carry on for hours. So I hope you'll come back one day. But Peter does have to get a taxi at 3:45, and I expect you're all going to rush him when you go out. So to make sure he gets into that taxi safely. So I think we do need to wind up, if that's okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, big thank you to yourself and other staff and all of you. On the table there by the door, there's some more flyers about my Human Rights Foundation. If any of you are interested, please take one. There's no obligation. On the back it tells you how to sign up to the email bulletins and Facebook and Twitter. We do lots of issues that are below the radar, that don't get reported in the mainstream press, and we often invite you to participate in campaigns. Unfortunately, they're mostly London-based events, but some of these campaigns, are global, and you can get involved by signing email petitions or writing to your Member of Parliament and so on. So please take one, or if you know someone who's not here, take an extra one for them as well. But we rely on your support, so thank you very much and good luck with your studies. Thank you very much.